Times the Brief. These are the top stories of the day.
Brought to you by Audible.
I fled Hurricane Katrina when I was 12 years old. We can't forget the kids of Louisiana today. By Edward Buckles, Jr. Buckles is the director of the upcoming HBO documentary Katrina Babies, which offers an intimate look at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and its impact on the youth of New Orleans. In the aftermath of Hurricane Ida, it's hard to think of my childhood in New Orleans. I don't remember doing anything without my close-knit family. We would meet on a random weekday to sing happy birthday to one another, or my mom would sew matching outfits for us to wear so we'd be fresh on Easter Sunday. We did almost everything as a unit. Summertime in New Orleans was my favorite. School was out, and I could spend all of my time with my siblings and cousins. The adults would drop us off in the 7th Ward at my cousin Tina's house because she had 4 children, so that was a natural hangout spot for us. We would make up neighborhood street games, go on quests, and play outside until darkness fell and the streetlights came on. Summer was like one big celebration for us. We would throw block parties, house parties, and at the end of the summer, we would have one big bash to celebrate the last weekend before the new school year. But in 2005, everything changed. We never thought that the last weekend of summer vacation would be our last one together. I was 12 years old. But while it's difficult to think back to that time, we all must do so for the sake of children in Louisiana today, because Hurricane Katrina didn't just destroy our homes. The storm uprooted and changed our lives forever. While my mom and dad decided to evacuate my sisters and I at the 11th hour, my cousins decided to not leave. They wanted to ride the storm out, which wasn't uncommon. In fact, it was very much normal for New Orleanians to not flinch at warnings of hurricanes because they were often false alarms, and in most cases, many natives didn't have the means to just get up and go. So I was surprised when my mom woke my sister and I up early on that Sunday morning in a panic. I remember her saying that there was something in my spirit telling me we should leave. So we followed my mama's intuition and packed a weekend's worth of clothes, some cold-cut sandwiches and snacks for the road, and headed west of Louisiana. As kids, evacuations felt more like vacations, and we were excited about missing school and getting to travel to a new place. This feeling changed quickly after a journey that would normally take 2 hours took 14 hours because of traffic. This was not like past evacuations. Exhausted, tempers began to flare, so we stopped at a flea market-turned shelter that was taking in evacuees. I remember falling asleep on a hard concrete floor in the shelter and waking up to see the adults glued to a television. I walked over to the television to get a glimpse of what had them paralyzed. I immediately saw New Orleans, my New Orleans, underwater. I vividly recall seeing a shot of the Circle food store in the 7th Ward. This was the neighborhood that was in close proximity to where all of my cousins lived. In a panic, I asked the adults surrounding me, "If the Circle food store is underwater, where are my cousins?" One adult looked at me and said, "Everyone in New Orleans is dead." I started crying. I believed that my family was dead for quite a while, until we finally got a call from them and learned that they had been rescued by boat from the floodwaters. Learning that my family survived the storm was a huge relief, but the special bond and closeness that we all once shared was washed away forever after they were displaced. They never returned home, even after New Orleans was reopened. In 2021, the children who experienced Hurricane Katrina are now adults. We are artists, entrepreneurs, parents, homeowners, and so much more. When it came to healing the open wounds and trauma that Katrina caused, we didn't receive much support from the federal government, or anyone for that matter. Instead, we are working to heal ourselves while also trying to bring back the place that we love so much. This process was interrupted on the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, when another Category 4 hurricane made its presence known in the Gulf. This storm tore through Louisiana once again, leaving some areas submerged in water and most of the state without power for possibly weeks. From the physical damage to the neglect and slow response of the federal government, this is all too familiar to what we experienced in 2005. As I write this, there are people who are suffering from severe heat temperatures with no electricity, lack of food and water, and barely any support or help. Everyone loves Louisiana, especially New Orleans, for our culture, food, and spirit. People speak highly of our resilience and strength. But as a native, let me just say that we are tired of being resilient and strong. At this moment, we are asking the world to give their resources, time, and attention to the thousands of Black and brown people who are on the verge of being neglected during their lowest point again. I started filming my documentary, Katrina Babies. Time Studios is co-producing Buckles' upcoming documentary, about 7 years ago, after I began to recognize my own trauma as well as the trauma of my peers. I was fed up with our feelings being ignored, so I worked on telling our stories in this documentary with the hope of inspiring the rest of the world to learn about the lack of response in 2005 and prevent it from happening again. As I watch the slow response to Hurricane Ida, I am feeling PTSD from my childhood. I will ache if another generation of children has to experience the trauma and neglect that my peers and I experienced in our childhood. I am encouraging the rest of the world to not look away from what is happening in Louisiana just because the news cameras are gone. Help the place that gives you so much joy and culture during their moment of need. Just 39 female journalists are still working in Kabul after the Taliban's takeover, by Amy Gunia. Only a few dozen women journalists are still working in Kabul following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, despite the Islamist group's assurance at a press conference that they would honor women's rights under Islam. Among the women who fled is female news anchor Beheshta Argand, who interviewed a senior Taliban leader on air in August. She told CNN that fear of the Taliban drove her to leave the country. Zara Joya, who founded Rukshana Media, a media organization that acts as a platform for women journalists, also left Afghanistan last week. I decided to leave the country as soon as possible. I felt that I was at risk, she tells Time from quarantine in the UK. Just 39 women journalists are still formally working in privately owned radio and TV stations in the Afghan capital, according to Reporters Without Borders, RSF, its partner organization, the Center for the Protection of Afghan Women Journalists, CPAWJ. That's a precipitous drop from the 700 women journalists working in 2020. Women journalists must be able to resume working without being harassed as soon as possible, because it is their most basic right, because it is essential for their livelihood, and also because their absence from the media landscape would have the effect of silencing all Afghan women, RSF Secretary General Christophe Deloire said in a press release. We urge the Taliban leadership to provide immediate guarantees for the freedom and safety of women journalists. Joya is still in contact with several women journalists on the ground in Afghanistan, and she continues to publish their work on Rukshana Media, though some of them are now using pseudonyms. I'm very worried about their safety. It's very painful and hard, she says. In Afghanistan's provinces, nearly all women journalists stopped working as the Taliban took control, according to the survey. More than 1,700 women were working for media outlets in the provinces of Kabul, Herat, and Balkh in 2020. International observers, rights groups, and Afghan women have all expressed concern over what Taliban rule will mean for women in Afghanistan. The Taliban has promised to protect human rights, but it made similar promises when they took over the country in 1996, before banning women from work and education, largely confining them to the home. This time, the Taliban has encouraged women to return to work and allowed girls to return to school. But members of the Taliban have barred female journalists Khadija Amin and Shabnan Dawran from their jobs at the public broadcaster Radio Television Afghanistan, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ. RTA employed 140 women journalists until mid-August, but none of them have gone back to work at the state TV channels, according to the report. Joya says that many of her friends and colleagues are staying at home out of fear. I don't believe the Taliban. It's very clear that they won't accept women's rights or human rights, she says. Zan TV, Dari for Woman TV, and Bano TV, Dari for Mrs. TV, have ceased all activity since August 15th, according to the report. These privately owned TV channels employed more than 80 women journalists. A female journalist working in the southeastern province of Ghazni said that the Taliban warned that her radio station could continue operating, but without music and women's voices, according to the report. A Taliban spokesman told the BBC that there was room for women in the new government, but in the top posts in the cabinet, there may not be women. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet said on August 24th that the treatment of women and girls is a fundamental red line that should not be crossed. Joya says that although she's no longer in the country, she plans to continue her work to highlight Afghan women's voices. I believe we should struggle against the Taliban and continue to fight for our rights, she says, and I'm trying to continue my work. How the origins of epidemiology are linked to the transatlantic slave trade, by Jim Downs. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, many have been frustrated by the ways in which the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, keeps changing its rules in response to the pandemic. What most don't understand is that the field of epidemiology is always like that. Protocols about how to control an epidemic mostly develop in the middle of crises, but those crises have not only been of the medical variety, and knowing more about that history provides an important lesson for those living through the pandemic today. In fact, many of the tools that we are using to control the pandemic, observation, surveillance, and data collection, developed not from scientific inquiry in isolated laboratories, but rather as urgent responses to crises that arose due to the transatlantic slave trade and the expansion of the British Empire. That troubling past is a reminder of how medical advances can occur on the backs of human beings with no say in the matter. Slavery and imperialism both led to unprecedented social arrangements that congregated people into crowded environments where they were under constant surveillance. Although military and government officials established surveillance mechanisms to subjugate these populations, doctors were also part of these regimes and began to observe the spread of infectious disease. Slave ships and colonial plantations emerged as new environments that enabled doctors to study epidemics. Their investigations happened just as medical knowledge in general was undergoing a transformation. Doctors began to move away from the idea that supernatural forces produced epidemics and began to turn to how environments caused the spread of infectious diseases. Most histories trace the development of epidemiology to London in the mid-19th century, when physician John Snow ventured into a poor neighborhood in Victorian London to investigate a cholera outbreak. By collecting data of various patients and observing their daily practices, Snow eventually traced the disease's spread to a water pump in the center of the neighborhood. He expanded the role of the physician from a healer to a detective. By observing the cholera outbreak in real time, Snow was able to control it. He subsequently became lauded as the father of epidemiology. But this label is not entirely accurate. Snow was part of the London Epidemiological Society, which included a group of physicians who had, out of necessity, become investigators of global epidemics. The doctors who served on slave ships, colonial regimes, and throughout the empire became the first epidemiologists. The tools to manage the empire, record-keeping, surveillance, and observation, have also, by no coincidence, become the major tools that epidemiologists depend on today. While there are scores of books that examine the vexed history of medicine and imperialism, namely how these violent takeovers led to the spread of infectious disease, British imperialism also created vast bureaucracy that enabled physicians to systematically document their observations, collect data, and serve as the liaisons between the medical profession and the government. When a cholera pandemic broke out in Jamaica in 1850, British government authorities sent Gavin Milroy, a Scottish physician and Snow's colleague, to assess the outbreak in order to protect its economic investment in the Caribbean. Milroy treated a black fisherman named Phipps, who lived near the, quote, filthy Negro yards, and left his hovel early in the morning to go to a nearby village. During the day, he was attacked with diarrhea and pain in the bowels. After returning home, Phipps felt faint and very weak. The symptoms persisted into the next afternoon, and Phipps died the following morning. He is thought to be the first cholera case in Kingston. Milroy also evaluated the housing conditions that black Jamaicans had to endure. He noted that the lack of ventilation exacerbated the spread of disease. 6 to 10 people might be crowded together at night in a small room with the windows and doors closed. Milroy, observing the disease in the middle of a crisis, ultimately concluded that cholera spread as a result of unsanitary conditions. Decades earlier, in 1783-84, physician Thomas Trotter was assigned to oversee the health conditions aboard the Brooks, a slave ship that transported captive Africans to the Caribbean and the southern United States. When Trotter went below deck, he later wrote that it was difficult to move without treading upon them, and that he struggled to breathe. No precautions were taken to preserve the health of the slaves. At one point, an African man whom Trotter described as corpulent complained of a hardness on his right arm. By the next day, the hardness had spread to the upper part of his forearm, and he experienced some contraction at the joint of the elbow. Eventually, it spread to the shoulder, neck, and lower jaw. Once the enslaved man's neck was affected, he became delirious. His tongue was locked between the teeth and then lolled out of his mouth for 3 days before he died. Trotter's initial treatment, a warm bath and medicine, was ineffective. When he inspected the man's mouth, he noticed that his gums were spongy and bleeding, his back teeth were loose, and his breath was extremely disagreeable. Once he noticed these symptoms, he was convinced that the man was suffering from scurvy. By April 1784, 3 months after the ship had departed from Africa, 7 to 8 people had died. Trotter reported that the number of enslaved Africans with scurvy continued to escalate. Of the roughly 600 enslaved Africans who arrived in the Caribbean, Trotter diagnosed 300 of them as having some degree of scurvy. Decades earlier, in the 1740s, the Royal Navy surgeon James Lind had demonstrated that consuming oranges and lemons could cure scurvy, but the treatment was contested at the time. Trotter, who had limited experience in treating the disease, noticed the enslaved Africans, like other scorbutic patients he had observed, displayed a strong desire for acidic foods. Through an experiment, Trotter found that those who ate ripe guavas did not improve, while those who consumed limes or green guavas were almost well. Once the ship arrived in Antigua, and then when it stopped in St. John, Trotter procured fresh vegetables and fruits to feed those who had scurvy. Once the enslaved Africans began to eat citrus fruit, their symptoms quickly dissipated and their health improved. In 1786, after returning from his voyage, Trotter published Observations on the Scurvy in London. A revised edition appeared in 1792. In the book, Trotter not only used his observations of enslaved Africans to corroborate Lynn's theory, but he also disputed alternative theories and discussed factors that increased susceptibility to the disease. The field of epidemiology, however, is not simply about the methods innovated by even the most sophisticated medical practitioners. It's a field that studies, in clinical terms, populations, but in more colloquial terms, people. Imperialism and the transatlantic slave trade depended on the violent subjugation of people. There are many history books that have powerfully detailed these horrors, but this form of violence also has indelibly informed the advancement of science. Our efforts to control the pandemic were not invented by scientists at the World Health Organization or even by doctors 2 centuries ago in Europe and the United Kingdom. Instead, the tools to control the pandemic began when doctors observed the spread of infectious disease among enslaved and colonized people. At the heart of epidemiology is a history of violence and conquest. Imperialism and the transatlantic slave trade depended on the violent use of power to assert authority over people in a particular setting in order to understand how diseases spread. The names of the anonymous people who doctors studied have been mostly lost, not seen as a vital part of this larger scientific transformation, despite the fact that their sickness and often death led to the creation of epidemiology. The conditions in which these people suffered also reveals a key aspect about epidemiological practice, that new insights about the spread of epidemics happen on the ground in real time and cannot be simply imagined or even predicted as part of a thought experiment. History urges us to remember that at the center of epidemiology are people who are suffering. Everyone procrastinates. Here's how to accomplish what matters most to you, by Oliver Burkeman. Burkeman is the author of 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. There must be few opinions more widely held when it comes to the art of time management than that procrastination is always and exclusively a bad thing. Naturally, history's annoyingly overproductive types, the Benjamin Franklins of the world, have always disdained the tendency to procrastinate, but then so have most procrastinators themselves. The inner struggle to eradicate the trait has driven many a celebrated genius to desperate measures, as when Victor Hugo had his clothes locked away so that he couldn't wander the streets of Paris, and instead was obliged to keep writing The Hunchback of Notre Dame in a state of near nudity. But there's another way to think about procrastination, one that's arguably more relevant than ever today when it comes to the challenge of managing our daily time. We live in a world of infinite inputs. There's no meaningful limit to the number of emails you could receive or demands your boss could make, nor, for that matter, to the number of creative projects, business ventures, or exotic vacations you might wish to pursue. And in this situation, there's a sense in which procrastination isn't so much a bad thing as an unavoidable one. At any given moment, you'll be procrastinating on almost everything, and by the end of your life, you'll have gotten around to doing only a fraction of the things you hypothetically could have done. So the goal, in the words of the contemporary American spiritual author Greg Kretsch, isn't to eradicate procrastination, but to become a better procrastinator, making the best choices about what projects and tasks to allow to languish so as to free up time, energy, and attention for what matters the most. Traditional time management has long held out the implicit promise of getting on top of everything, of becoming the master of one's time. The yearning for this feeling of control over the unfolding hours and days is an old one. Back in 1908, in a short book entitled How to Live on 24 Hours a Day, the English journalist and novelist Arnold Bennett offered scheduling tips to that innumerable band of souls who are haunted, more or less painfully, by the feeling that the years slip by and slip by and slip by, and they have not yet been able to get their lives into proper working order. Back then, it was still possible to believe that with the right methods and enough self-discipline, getting on top of it all might be feasible, but no more. The pace of technological change and ratcheting economic competition mean it's worth our asking if it might be time to give up the fight, to wave goodbye to the prospect of ever mastering our time, precisely so that we can focus on actually getting down to work on a handful of things that really count. One problem is that the technologies we use to try to make our lives more efficient or fulfilling systematically fail us, because they increase the size of the everything on which we're trying to get on top. For example, Facebook is a great way of finding out about events you might like to attend, but it also inevitably means finding out about more interesting events than anyone ever possibly could attend, leading to the modern curse of FOMO, the fear of missing out, which diminishes the pleasure of attending any one event thanks to the vague worry that you might have been happier doing something else. Similarly, email is a pretty good tool for handling a large volume of messages, but then again, if it weren't for email, you wouldn't be receiving such a large number of messages in the first place. Becoming a better procrastinator needn't mean eschewing such tools entirely, but it does mean dropping the inner quest to do it all in favor of making better and more conscious choices about what to pursue or pass up. One way to do this, as the creativity coach Jessica Abel explains, is to pay yourself first when it comes to time. It's an old piece of wisdom originating in personal finance. Far better to put some money aside into savings as soon as you're paid, rather than hoping there'll be some left over once you've handled the costs of living. Likewise, if you try to find time for your most valuable activities by first dealing with all the other important-seeming demands you face, the emails and unpaid bills, the dishwasher that needs emptying, in the hope that there'll be time left over at the end, you're likely to be disappointed. So, if a certain project really matters to you, the only way to be sure it will happen is to do some of it now, first, today, no matter how little, and no matter how many other things may be making entirely legitimate claims on your attention. This is the same insight embodied in two venerable pieces of advice: to work on your most important project for the first hour of each day, and to protect your time by scheduling meetings with yourself, marking them in your calendar so that other commitments can't intrude. Thinking in terms of paying yourself first transforms these one-off tips into a philosophy of life, at the core of which lies a simple insight that if you plan to spend some of your approximately 4,000 weeks on the planet doing what matters most to you, then at some point you've just got to start doing it. In the end, though, learning to procrastinate better is less a matter of tips or techniques than a shift of perspective. It means coming to appreciate that not doing almost everything is an inevitability, and that the uncomfortable emotions triggered by such thoughts are just a matter of confronting what it means to be human. Because our time on Earth is so limited, it's absurd to try to spend it doing everything you've dreamed of or all you feel obliged to do. Just make it your goal to get better at deciding what to neglect.
This has been Times The Brief. For more stories, visit time.com.
Interested in learning more about the world outside your door? Try Audible. It has everything you love listening to, including an extensive collection of exclusive originals, podcasts, and audiobooks, like Greenlights, an unconventional memoir written and narrated by Matthew McConaughey. Or hear a behind-the-scenes account of an electrifying Broadway show turned movie with In the Heights, Finding Home. Try Audible for free with a 30-day trial when you sign up at audible.com. Spoken Layer.